In the previous lecture, we considered the imagery of the swan, which, compared with the dove, emerged from the dark waters rather than from the air. In the next part of the vision, the native man is standing with a man from the Asian East, and this man now pushes the native into the water. We commented previously that this man from the East represents a culturally contingent relationship with the unconscious, while the native man was the natural primitive mind. Jung begins by suggesting that the deep waters into which the native is pushed represent the deeper layers of the unconscious, so that if the native man represents the personification of the unconscious, then that personification, the guide, is now immersed in the deeper layers of the unconscious, and in particular, the collective unconscious. Jung then provides a description of this collective unconscious, and that's what we'll consider in this video. He starts by describing the elements of consciousness in his psychological system, wherein the persona mediates between the ego, which is the inner conscious life, and the outer world. In the same way, the personification of the unconscious, what we might call the soul, mediates between consciousness and both the personal and collective unconscious. He then starts to define the collective unconscious as an invisible and unknown reality, just as, for example, the operations of the liver are, to the conscious mind, invisible and unknown. The collective unconscious is presented through mediation by the soul, and the soul, he says, is often a contrasexual personification. The unconscious is presented as an image or the representation of raw feeling coming into consciousness. This mediating soul must then be applied to the collective unconscious, which Jung says, quote, deals with people of whole continents and millions of years of human life. Just as the persona wishes to wear particular sorts of clothing to particular social events, so too does the soul engage in a particular sort of way with the unconscious. When the soul comes before God, and it's interesting that he has now shifted his language from saying the collective unconscious to saying God, one must approach with one's soul in this particular sort of way, because the problem is not individual. It's been a collective problem, he says, for hundreds of millions of years. So we must know what the soul is. In the case of a man, he says, the soul is concerned with 1,000 resentments. It is not appropriate in his everyday life to address the world with his resentments, but it's perfectly appropriate to direct the resentments of the soul to the collective unconscious. In the case of a woman, he says, the soul is concerned with that which her persona often cannot be, and that is matters of opinion, and it is most appropriate for her soul to address the collective unconscious in that way. This begins to describe what it means that the native man was pushed into the deep water. These functions of the soul now address the collective unconscious. The vision continues, and the deep pond now begins to take the shape of a river, or Jung interprets the collective unconscious, now addressed through the soul, changes shape, changes from stagnant water to a river, perhaps the river of life. So the patient, now addressing the collective unconscious with her soul, encounters a new form of the collective unconscious, one that is dynamic and represents life. The vision continues. At one end of the river stands the Eastern man, at the other now a stork. The stork retains the meaning of the Holy Ghost, he says, meaning in its psychological aspect, no less than a violent ecstasis, ecstasy, or most technically, the being one side oneself, or even to see God. Yet Jung provides a second aspect of the Holy Ghost associated with those myths, in which the white bird snatches a person up and carries them away, or even those representations of the bird in mythology often associated with thieves. That, he says, is a different kind of descent of the Holy Ghost from the traditional interpretation of the Church, and this, Jung comments, is because of the great power of the experience of the Holy Ghost as ecstasis, the consequences of which often appear unusual. So we have seen in this lecture that when the soul approaches the unconscious, there is an autonomous movement of the unconscious, and we have seen that even Jung begins to understand this movement as the very movement of God. Through this movement, the soul and the individual encounters the person of the Holy Ghost, and we will pick up this discussion of the Holy Ghost next time.